Disconnect her. The lawyer has already forged the inheritance papers, shouted my evil husband to the witch of my mother-in-law, laughing while I was in a coma. But the fool never imagined that my revenge for everything he put me through started the day I myself hired the so-called lawyer. And that's when my game began. The monotonous sound of machines filled the room, accompanying the slow beat of Maria's heart. A haunting calm floated in the air, broken only by the occasional beep of the monitor that vigilantly tracked her life. The hospital, which had always been a symbol of hope and healing, now became the stage for a dark conspiracy, as lethal as the shadows that cloaked the night. Maria lay motionless in bed, her eyes closed, her body immersed in an almost total stillness. To anyone watching her, she appeared unconscious, trapped in the limbo of a deep coma. But what no one knew, what even her closest loved ones couldn't suspect, was that her mind was awake, sharp, capturing every detail, every word. And that was how she heard the beginning of her own condemnation. Carmen, her mother-in-law, entered the room with firm and calculated steps, as if she were used to commanding every space she walked into. Beside her, Alejandro, Maria's husband, looked defeated, as if the situation was consuming him. They approached the foot of the bed, and Carmen, with a cold smile, looked at her son. "It's time," Carmen said, breaking the silence with a voice that showed not a trace of compassion. "You know this is best for everyone." "She's no longer here, Alejandro, no more than a shadow of what she once was." "You know that." Alejandro didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved from the still figure of his wife to the cold tiles on the floor, as if searching for an answer that wouldn't come. The weight of the decision was crushing him. Maria, in her immobility, could feel the tension in the air, the latent doubt in her husband. Carmen, growing impatient, took a step closer and, in an almost inaudible whisper, added, "Disconnect her. The lawyer has already forged the inheritance papers. Everything's ready." Maria's stomach churned. Her breathing, though controlled, became irregular. The woman who had welcomed her as a daughter-in-law, her husband's mother, was condemning her to death to take her inheritance. And Alejandro, how could he even hesitate? How could he think of going through with such a plan? Alejandro took a deep breath, still not lifting his eyes. "What if she wakes up?" he finally murmured, his voice broken but still full of uncertainty. "She won't wake up." Carmen snapped, her tone sharp as if the very idea was absurd to her. "You can't cling to false hopes, son. If we go through with this, everything will be ours. No more hospitals, no more expenses, no more complications." Maria wouldn't have wanted to live like this. Carmen leaned in closer, her cold eyes piercing through him. "What do you prefer? A life of ruin or a fresh start with everything that's rightfully yours?" Alejandro closed his eyes, trapped in an emotional whirlwind. His mother's words, as always, twisted in his mind, distorting his judgment. Carmen had always been the dominant figure in his life, subtle in her manipulation, an expert at making her desires seem inevitable. And now, once again, he was on the verge of yielding to her control. But in the bed, beneath the appearance of stillness, Maria fought with a fury she had never known. Years of distrust toward Carmen were beginning to make sense. The woman who had tried to control every aspect of their lives from the start now wanted to erase her from existence, erase her as if she had never meant anything. Her heart pounded, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. The betrayal of her husband, the cruelty of her mother-in-law, all of it enveloped her, but something else emerged from the darkness, a fierce determination to survive and uncover the extent of the lies. Carmen turned on her heel, heading toward the door. "I'll talk to Felipe tomorrow. Don't worry, he has everything under control. We just need your decision." And with those words, she disappeared from the room, leaving Alejandro alone with his wife. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. Alejandro slowly approached Maria's bed, his hand trembling as he brushed hers. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know what to do." Maria, unable to move or respond, felt the warmth of her husband's hand on hers. A warmth that once would have been comforting, but now only brought her disgust. Every word, every touch, every apology was nothing more than a lie wrapped in weakness. He hesitated, but the mere hesitation made him complicit. When he finally left, Maria was alone in the darkness. Her mind, once trapped in panic, now began to focus. She had to act, but she couldn't do it alone. And then, like a flash in the storm, she thought of Felipe, the lawyer. Felipe had been more than just a family acquaintance. Years ago, they had shared moments in college. Although life had taken them in different directions, Maria always remembered him as someone with integrity, someone who wouldn't be easily corrupted. And if Carmen had recruited him for this macabre plan, maybe there was hope that not everything was lost. The door to the room opened again. Felipe entered, his expression calm, but with a slight shadow of concern on his face. He reviewed the documents in his hands, but as he looked at Maria, his eyes revealed something beyond mere legal formalities. "Maria," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "This isn't right." In the previous days, Felipe had begun to suspect Carmen and Alejandro. The irregularities in the documents, the rushed meetings, and the growing feeling that something dark was hidden in this family had kept him on edge. Now, standing before Maria, his suspicions were turning into certainties. He leaned in close to her ear, ensuring no one else could hear. "I know what they're doing. I'm going to help you, but we need time." From deep within her mind, Maria felt a spark of hope. Felipe was her only way out, her only chance to survive this betrayal. She couldn't move a muscle, but inside her, the fight for her life had already begun. The tension in the air was palpable. With every step Felipe took as he left the room, the plot thickened. Carmen thought she had everything under control. Alejandro was on the edge of the abyss, trapped in his own doubts. And Maria, though trapped in her own bodily prison, now had a single mission: to uncover the whole truth, dismantle the lies surrounding her, and survive those who wanted her dead. Morning arrived, but for Maria, trapped in her silent prison, every second seemed endless. Her body remained still, but her mind never rested. The plan that was forming between her husband and mother-in-law was beginning to take shape. Carmen's words still echoed in her head. "Disconnect her. The lawyer has already forged the inheritance papers." It was a dark echo that filled her more and more with anger, but also with determination. Felipe had promised to help her, but he still didn't know how or when. Everything depended on time, and Maria knew that Carmen wouldn't take long before attempting her next move. At that precise moment, the hospital door swung open. Carmen entered with unsettling energy, her heels pounding on the floor like hammer blows. Beside her walked Felipe, holding a folder of documents in his hand, with a neutral expression on his face. It was the face he had perfected after years of litigation, but inside, he was full of unease. "Felipe," Carmen said with that poison sweetness she always used, "I need you to confirm that everything is ready. I want this process to end as soon as possible. Maria has suffered enough. It's time to free her, to free all of us." Felipe looked at her for a second, and in those brief moments, his mind processed the double game he had to play. He knew he had to be careful. Carmen wasn't easy to deceive, and a misstep would endanger both Maria and himself. He smiled, hiding his true intention, and nodded slowly. "Everything is under control," he replied firmly. "The documents are ready, and as soon as we get Alejandro's authorization, we'll proceed." Carmen smiled, a smile that seemed too perfect, almost like a mask. "Perfect," she whispered. "Felipe, dear, I always knew I could count on you." The tension in the air was palpable. Carmen, feeling more confident, moved closer to Felipe with an intense look. What happened next was unexpected. Carmen, in a gesture filled with hidden intentions, placed her hand on Felipe's arm and pulled him a little closer. Her fingers slid smoothly over the fabric of his shirt, and her face showed an expression far beyond mere professional gratitude. "You know, Felipe," she said in a lower, almost seductive tone, "I've always admired your ability to do what's necessary, without questions. People like you are invaluable, and invaluable people deserve to be rewarded." Her words were full of insinuations, her closeness increasingly invasive. Felipe felt the weight of the moment, but maintained his control. The tension between them grew suffocating, and Maria, immobile in her bed, was witness to that scene, filled with a dark and twisted tension. Carmen, a woman who pretended to be a maternal figure of power, now revealed a much more disturbing side. She was trying to seduce the man who held her fate in his hands. Felipe subtly distanced himself, avoiding the physical contact but without losing composure. "Carmen," he said with a courteous smile, "my loyalty has always been with the family. Everything I do is to ensure this ends in the best way possible." Carmen stared at him, evaluating every word. She was smart, too smart to be easily fooled, but at that moment, her desire for control clouded her judgment. She didn't suspect that Felipe was already on Maria's side, preparing a plan that would put her entire world at risk. When Carmen left, convinced that everything was under control, Felipe approached Maria's bed, his expression immediately changing to genuine concern. He leaned close enough to whisper near her without any hospital cameras or staff noticing the movement of his lips. "I'm making progress, but we have to be cautious," he said, his voice containing a restrained seriousness. "Carmen isn't the only enemy here. Alejandro is more trapped under her influence than I thought. I can't trust him. He's broken." Maria, though still unable to respond, felt every word from Felipe like an anchor to reality. She knew time was crucial and that any mistake could be fatal. Her husband, the man who had promised to love her, was submerged in his mother's manipulations. Alejandro was weak, and that weakness made him an even greater threat than Carmen. That same afternoon, Alejandro returned to the hospital. The weight of the world seemed to have fallen on his shoulders, and his expression was tinged with deep sadness. He sat next to Maria's bed, holding her hand between his, but this time there was no warmth in that gesture. It was more of a burden he had to bear. "Maria," he murmured, his voice trembling. "I don't know what to do." Tears began to well up in his eyes. "Mom says this is what's best for you, for everyone. But I don't know if I can." His voice cracked, and in that moment, Maria felt a twinge of compassion, although her anger still burned. Alejandro wasn't a monster, not in the strict sense, but he was weak. Too weak to defend her, too weak to see the truth. Alejandro stood up abruptly, unable to bear the tension consuming him. "I need time," he said, almost as if talking to himself. "I just need time." As he moved away from the bed, the door opened again, and Laura, Alejandro's sister, made an unexpected entrance. Her face showed a mix of emotions, and her eyes shone with something Maria couldn't quite identify. "Here again?" Laura said in a tone that didn't fully hide her resentment. "What are you waiting for, Alejandro? For her to wake up miraculously? We all know Mom is right." "Maria isn't going to wake up." Alejandro frowned at her, clearly irritated by her presence. "It's not that simple, Laura. It's not that easy to just let her go." "Of course it's easy," Laura replied, moving closer to him with a defiant attitude. "It's easy when you realize this doesn't make sense anymore. Mom has a plan. She always has. And you, as always, can't make a decision." Maria watched, unable to intervene, but feeling the situation between the two siblings escalating quickly. Laura, unlike Alejandro, didn't seem to have any moral conflict. For her, it was all about getting what she wanted, and there was no room for doubt. "What you don't understand," Laura, Alejandro said, growing more furious, "is that this isn't just about the papers. It's about Maria, about what she would have wanted. It's not just a financial decision." Laura laughed, a cold laugh that echoed in the room. "Do you think Maria would care? She's dead, Alejandro. You just need to admit it." The atmosphere became stifling. The tension between the siblings was obvious, and while Alejandro wrestled with his morality and his mother's manipulations, Laura had no such scruples. She was ready to do whatever was necessary, regardless of the consequences. For her, Maria was just another obstacle in the way. At that moment, Felipe, who had remained silent, intervened. "It's not as simple as it seems," he said calmly. "There are legal and ethical implications. Maria still has rights, and if we decide to disconnect her, it will be under strict medical and legal protocols." Laura looked at him with disdain, but her influence didn't reach Felipe. She knew he was right, though she didn't care. In her world, rules were meant to be broken, and lives were meant to be used. With each passing minute, the abyss between the siblings grew, and Maria realized that the battle wasn't just against Carmen. Now, it was against a family that had lost its humanity. The atmosphere inside the hospital was more tense than ever. The air, thick with repressed emotions and unspoken betrayals, became suffocating. The hallways were no longer a refuge of hope for Maria, but a maze of deception and lies, where each person played their own role in the deadly game unfolding around her. Maria, from her motionless prison, could feel that something dark was about to erupt. And that something came with the name Laura. Laura, Alejandro's sister, had arrived like an unexpected storm, dragging with her more than just resentment. Her abrupt entrance and disdain for Maria's condition were only the prelude to something far deeper and more disturbing. What no one knew was that Laura had her own plan, one that would shake the family's foundations forever. Alejandro entered the room once more. His shoulders slumped, his gaze lost. It was clear he hadn't slept, but guilt and conflict kept him on edge. He knew he couldn't escape the decisions in front of him, but more than anything, he knew his mother and sister were slowly taking over his will. "Maria," he murmured, taking her hand once more. His touch, once full of affection, was now hesitant, as if he were caught between two worlds. "I don't know what to do. Laura and Mom, they're pushing so hard. They want it all to end, but something's holding me back." Silently, Maria wished she could scream, wished she could tell him that the people he trusted were conspiring against her, that not everything was as it seemed. But all she could do was keep listening, waiting for the right moment to act. As Alejandro continued to struggle, the door opened again, this time with Laura in the lead. Her entrance was abrupt, full of energy, with a look that radiated determination. "You're still here whining?" she spat, her voice cold enough to chill the air. "What are you waiting for, Alejandro? For her to wake up and tell you everything's fine? You're just dragging out the inevitable." Alejandro stood up abruptly, surprised by his sister's aggressive tone. "It's not that simple, Laura. This is my wife. It's not just about signing a paper and being done." Laura laughed, a laugh that sounded hollow, but carried years of resentment. "Always so weak, Alejandro. Always letting Mom tell you what to do, and now you want the situation to control you too? It's ridiculous. Maria isn't going to wake up. It's time to accept reality." The silence between the two siblings grew heavy. From her bed, Maria felt that something darker was brewing in Laura. It wasn't just her urgency to disconnect her. There was something more, something Maria couldn't quite grasp yet, but that was about to come to light. Laura took a few steps toward her brother, her face showing a mix of fury and desperation. "You know what, Alejandro? You've always been the favorite. Mom always protected you, always put you on a pedestal while I was ignored. And now that you have control of everything, you don't know what to do. I deserved what you have, not Maria. And you were never strong enough to stand up to Mom." Alejandro stepped back, shocked by the confession. "What are you saying?" "This isn't a competition, Laura. We're talking about Maria's life." Laura's eyes flared with an intensity that only hatred could fuel. "Exactly. And that's why I want it all to end. Mom always chose you. You and Maria. But not anymore. I won't let you keep everything while I get the scraps." Maria understood in that moment. Laura's hatred wasn't just for her, but for Alejandro too. Laura had always been in her brother's shadow, always seeking their mother's approval, and now that resentment was fueling her desire to destroy everything. "Why are you doing this?" Alejandro asked, his voice barely a whisper. Laura moved closer, her gaze filled with contempt. "Because it's my turn. It's always been your life, your wife, your future. And I'm tired of being left behind. Mom can say what she wants, but I'm not going to stand by while you play the martyr. Alejandro stared at her in disbelief, unable to process what he was hearing. The room filled with unbearable tension, and as the siblings continued to argue, the truth became increasingly clear. Laura didn't just want Maria gone, she wanted to destroy Alejandro too. It was at that precise moment that the hospital door opened for the third time, and Carmen appeared, immaculate as always, but with an expression that reflected calculated coldness. "What's going on here?" she asked in a dry tone, observing her two children as if they were mere pawns on her chessboard. Laura turned toward her mother, not hiding her disdain. "What's always been going on, Mom? You manipulating everything as usual." Carmen looked at her face momentarily puzzled before hardening quickly. "This isn't a game, Laura. We're talking about Maria's inheritance, the family's future. Not your whims." "My whims?" Laura laughed again, but this time the laugh was bitter. "You ignored me my whole life. It was always Alejandro, the perfect son, and then Maria, the perfect wife. You never gave me anything. But not anymore. I'm not staying behind, Mom. Not anymore." Carmen took a step toward her voice now lower, almost threatening. "Be careful what you say, Laura. You have no idea what I've done for this family." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Alejandro, who had been at the center of the conflict until now, stepped back, confused by the intensity of the emotions his loved ones were displaying. From her bed, Maria felt the chasm between them all growing, and that the secrets each of them held were beginning to unravel. It was then that Felipe entered the room. His face showed a mix of determination and caution. He had heard enough from the hallway to know the situation had reached a critical point. He closed the door behind him and spoke firmly. "That's enough. We can't keep pretending this is just a medical decision. There's much more at stake here, and we all know it." Carmen looked at him coldly. "Felipe, this isn't your business. You're just here to handle the paperwork." Felipe didn't back down. "No, Carmen. Not anymore. This isn't just about papers. There are lives at stake, and the manipulations that have been going on can't be ignored." Laura, who had kept her distance from Felipe until now, moved closer with a gleam in her eyes. "And you? Whose side are you really on, Felipe? Are you Mom's loyal dog, or is there something else you're not telling us?" Felipe looked her directly in the eye. "I'm on the side of the truth. And what's happening here can't continue." At that moment, the tension in the room reached its peak. Carmen, Alejandro, and Laura were standing on the edge of a precipice of revelations that would change everything. Maria, from her bed, knew the manipulation game was about to end, and when it did, no one would emerge unscathed. The hospital room, where Maria's fate hung by a thread, had become an emotional battlefield. Each character, each family member, carried their own secrets, and now the tension was unbearable. Felipe knew he was walking a thin line, but the time had come to expose everything, to free Maria from the clutches of a family willing to do the unthinkable for power and revenge. Carmen was the first to break the silence. With a look of disdain on her face, she shot a withering glance at Felipe. "Don't you dare jeopardize what we've already built. Maria isn't going to wake up. There's no point in prolonging this." Felipe stood firm. "Carmen, this is no longer about whether Maria wakes up or not. It's about what you've done, about what you and Alejandro are plotting. This isn't just a medical disconnection. This is premeditated murder." The words hit the air like a hammer, leaving everyone paralyzed. Alejandro, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward, his hands trembling. That's not true. I'm just following Mom's advice. I don't know anything about murder." Laura, from across the room, let out a sarcastic laugh, breaking the moment of shock. "Really, Alejandro? You really didn't know? Or did you just blind yourself because it was easier than facing the truth?" Carmen, seeing her plan unravel, made a desperate decision. She approached Felipe, almost pleading, but with the coldness that always characterized her. "Felipe, you don't have to do this. We can fix this, we can find another way. We've taken care of you all these years. Don't ruin everything." Felipe, with his eyes filled with a mix of rage and compassion for what he had discovered, took a deep breath before responding. Carmen, what you tried to do is unforgivable. You've manipulated your family, poisoned the relationships around you, all to maintain control. And now, you want to erase Maria as if she were just another inconvenience. Maria, from her bed, wished more than ever that she could get up, scream the truth, and stop Carmen. But she couldn't. Not yet. Her only hope was that Felipe could keep the situation under control. Laura, relishing the chaos unfolding, decided it was time to add her own dose of venom. Felipe's right, Alejandro. Mom isn't any saint. Did you know she manipulated Dad until the day he died? She pushed him to the limit so he would sign the entire fortune over to her. He didn't die by accident. Mom killed him, slowly, making sure he had no way out. And now she wants to do the same to you, using Maria as the scapegoat. Alejandro, shocked by his sister's words, felt the ground beneath his feet crumble. He looked at Carmen, searching for any sign that what Laura was saying wasn't true. But his mother's silence, her lack of denial, was what scared him the most. Carmen had been the figure who had controlled him his entire life, and now, all that control was crumbling in a cloud of betrayal. Is it true? Alejandro asked, his voice broken, almost inaudible. Carmen didn't respond. Her eyes, once filled with arrogance, now showed something she had never let others see: fear. She knew that, having reached this point, her options were limited. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Felipe, taking advantage of the confusion, delivered the final blow. This has to end. I've gathered the necessary evidence to prove what Carmen has been doing, not just with Maria's inheritance, but with everything she manipulated through her husband and her children. I've filed a formal complaint. The authorities are already aware of everything, and there will be no escape. Carmen, hearing those words, lost her composure. Her carefully constructed facade of years crumbled. No, you can't do this to me. Everything I did was for this family, for its future. Maria. Maria is nothing but a tool. She was never important. Carmen's scream echoed through the room, but there was no compassion in the looks that surrounded her. Even Alejandro, whom she had manipulated his entire life, stepped back, horrified to see the true nature of his mother. Maria, motionless in her bed, felt a deep sadness. She knew Carmen hated her, but she had never imagined the extent. At that moment, something unexpected happened. A slight movement ran through Maria's hand. Barely noticeable, but significant enough for Felipe, who was closest, to see it. His heart skipped a beat. Maria was waking up. Without making a sound, Felipe leaned over her and whispered in her ear, "Everything's going to be okay. You did it." Carmen, still in her hysterical state, didn't notice what was happening around her. Alejandro, devastated by his mother's betrayal, could only look on in disbelief. But Laura, always attentive to every detail, was the first to notice the change in Maria's face. What's happening?" she said in a low voice, trembling for the first time. Maria slowly opened her eyes. Her body, still weak from the effects of the coma, began to respond. The hospital monitors emitted a steady beeping, and the medical team rushed in. Chaos took over the room as doctors and nurses surrounded Maria, stabilizing her. But it was no longer a matter of medicine. Maria was back. Carmen, seeing her daughter-in-law open her eyes, staggered back, completely falling apart. No, it can't be. She wasn't supposed to wake up. She wasn't. Maria, still struggling to speak, looked directly at Carmen. She didn't need words. Her gaze said it all. "I know what you did, and now you'll pay." Alejandro, emotionally shattered, walked out of the room without saying a word. His world had collapsed, and he no longer knew whom to trust. Laura, watching her mother lose control, approached her with a bitter smile. "Well, Mom, looks like your reign is over." The authorities arrived shortly after, guided by the evidence Felipe had presented. Carmen was arrested in silence, still in shock. There was nothing she could say to change her fate. Everything she had built with lies and manipulation had crumbled before her eyes. In time, Maria regained her strength. Alejandro disappeared from her life, unable to face the magnitude of what had happened, while Laura, though free, distanced herself forever, knowing she no longer had a place in that broken family. Felipe stayed by her side, not just as a lawyer, but as a friend who never abandoned her. Time taught Maria a profound lesson. Sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones who hurt us the most. But she also learned that the truth, no matter how painful, always comes to light. And when it does, it's freeing. Maria's story ended with an unexpected twist, but in that conclusion, she found a deep reflection on life. The truth may take time to reveal itself, but it always finds its way, even through the darkest shadows. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to leave a comment about how you felt listening to it, and if you've gone through a similar deception, I would love for you to share your valuable opinion. I would be very honored if you gave it a like, shared the video with a friend or family member, and subscribed to the channel. Don't miss the next surprising story that's appearing on your screen right now. We have guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video.